I am Dr. Amara Thorne. My world is usually stainless steel and measured decisions. I handle million-dollar budgets and fragile human hearts. I run the surgical department at St. Jude's. Today, I was nobody, just the worried daughter sitting on thin paper in the examining room. My father, James Thorne, was across from me. He was wearing the pale blue gown that stripped him of his usual dignity. My father is a proud man, a veteran, a retired history professor. In that gown, he looked small. He looked defeated. The trouble started weeks ago. A persistent cough, a dull ache in his chest getting sharper. He finally agreed to see a specialist, Dr. Harrison Wells. He came highly recommended, supposedly. We waited 47 minutes past our scheduled time. Every ticking second felt like an insult we were expected to accept. When the door finally opened, Dr. Wells didn't apologize. He swept in, mid-50s, too confident. The kind of confidence that comes from never having to worry about being truly listened to. He barely looked at my father. He held the thick chart, his eyes scanning the demographic details. I watched his face shift, that subtle tightening around the eyes. The moment he realized we were the black family he was expecting. "Mr. Thorne," he said, the sound flat and impatient. "Tell me again about these persistent symptoms." My father spoke softly. He described the pain spreading to his shoulder, the shortness of breath when he tried to walk upstairs. He was precise. He always is. Dr. Wells cut him off instantly. He leaned back on his stool. He tapped a pen against the sterile tray. "Sir, you are 75, Wells interrupted, smiling patronizingly. "Are we sure this isn't simply the consequence of advanced age? Perhaps too many years enjoying the finer things? Rich food, sedentary living." I felt the sudden, hot rise of anger in my chest. I opened my mouth, ready to introduce myself, ready to use the title and the institutional power I had earned, ready to demand respect. But my father gave me a sharp, warning look. He knew what happened when we challenged them early. They always shut down completely. So I stayed silent. I let Wells continue the performance. My father tried to explain the severity of the attacks again. He mentioned a sharp, radiating pain that woke him up in the middle of the night. Wells laughed, not a sympathetic chuckle, a hard, dismissive sound that echoed off the tiled walls. "Waking you up at night, Mr. Thorne? Well, perhaps we should adjust your evening routine. Less anxiety, maybe less soul food before bed." He looked at me then, expecting agreement or shared humor at our expense. My blood ran cold. Less soul food. A casual clinical dismissal, wrapped in a stereotype, delivered without thought. My father's shoulders slumped. That was the deepest wound, watching my giant of a father shrink under the weight of one man's casual contempt. Wells scribbled something illegible on the chart, not looking at either of us. "I see no indication of anything acute here. We'll run some baseline blood work, maybe schedule an EKG next week. In the meantime, take 2 extra strength Tylenol and try to relax." "But, doctor," I finally managed, my voice low and dangerously calm. "The radiating pain is a classic indicator of—" He stopped writing. He looked at me over the top of his reading glasses. His eyes were ice cold. "Are you questioning my diagnostic procedure, young lady?" Wells asked, his voice hardening into professional hostility. "I've been practicing cardiology longer than you've been alive. I assure you, I know the difference between cardiac distress and geriatric anxiety." He stood up, signaling the end of the appointment. Total time elapsed since he walked in, 8 minutes and 30 seconds. "The EKG results will be sent to your primary care physician," Wells concluded, already moving toward the door. "Do schedule that follow-up. Though, honestly, Mr. Thorne, I think you'll find there's nothing wrong that a little more rest won't fix." He walked out, leaving the door ajar. The silence he left behind was a heavy blanket over the injustice. I stood up slowly. My hands were shaking, but my mind was utterly clear. I looked at the patient file Dr. Wells had left carelessly on the counter. The blood request forms were barely legible. The preliminary assessment box was checked. Hypochondria, age-related symptoms. I walked to the door. I could hear Wells down the hall, loudly chatting with a nurse about his weekend golf plans. I took out my phone. My fingers moved swiftly, navigating the secure portal of the State Medical Oversight Committee. This was the database only Section 6 administrators could access. I navigated to the Physician Credentials Review page. I paused before I typed the name. Dr. Harrison Wells. Amara, my father whispered, fear in his eyes. He thought I was just calling to complain or make a loud argument. Don't make a scene. It's not worth it. I looked at him, at the genuine, undeniable pain twisting his features. It is always worth it, Dad, I replied, my voice steady. I found Wells' professional profile, full licensing details, current institutional affiliations. The process was almost instantaneous because I was logged in with the highest authority codes. I drafted a brief formal notice. I typed in the necessary codes. I accessed the internal memo feature reserved for Section 6 administrators. I didn't need to yell. I didn't need to argue. I just needed to sign my name. Dr. Amara Thorne, Chief of Surgery, St. Jude's, Chair of the State Review Board, Section 6 Ethics Oversight, Incompetence, Patient Neglect, Immediate Suspension, Pending Comprehensive Review. I hit send. I took a deep breath, replacing the fury with cold control. The satisfaction was hollow, because my father was still desperately sick. I turned back to him. We are leaving this clinic, Dad. Right now. We are going to the hospital where they know exactly who you are and who I am. What did you do, Amara? He asked, his voice laced with dread. I picked up his chart and crumpled the bogus lab forms. I filed a disciplinary review. Don't worry about him. Worry about you. But as we walked out, passing the nurse's station, I heard the faint, high-pitched ring of a secured administrative line ringing relentlessly inside Dr. Wells' empty office. That sound meant the State Oversight Committee had just alerted the clinic director of a high-priority action. Dr. Harrison Wells had just 8 minutes left of his arrogance. The first shoe had dropped, heavy and final. Now, we had to worry about saving the man they had dismissed. I gripped my father's arm and guided him quickly toward the elevator. The frantic, ringing phone was the only music I needed. My silent promise of justice had been delivered, but the fight to save my father's life had just begun. He pointed at the charts. He didn't even look at the man sitting there. He simply spoke at my father, not to him. Mr. Davis, he sighed loudly, adjusting his glasses and rolling his eyes dramatically toward the young nurse standing by the door. We've seen worse, much worse. This is classic symptom magnification. He waved a hand dismissively at the clipboard. This fatigue? This heaviness in the chest? This is just age, stress. Maybe watch those carbs and get better sleep. My father, who had survived 2 tours overseas and worked 60 years in a steel mill, looked down at his hands. He was clutching the worn brim of his baseball cap, that quiet, defeated slump of his shoulders. That look was what finally broke the restraint I had imposed on myself. It was the look of a dignified man being treated like a hypochondriac child. Marcus started tapping his pen on the desk, a rhythmic, irritating, mocking sound. He leaned in, a patronizing smile fixed on his face. And the shortness of breath, Mr. Davis? Are we sure that isn't just exertion? Stairs? Maybe too much heavy food before bed? We need to be honest about our physical activity levels, right? The nurse chuckled weakly, trying to mask the sound behind a cough. My blood ran cold. I had been observing silently for 10 minutes, sitting in the corner chair, meant for family members. I wore civilian clothes. No scrubs, no ID badge visible. I wanted the unvarnished truth of how they treated black elders in this regional clinic when they assumed no one important was watching. I got it. It was far worse than the complaints I had archived on my encrypted hospital server about Dr. Marcus. I stood up slowly. I pushed my chair back an inch. The sound was barely a whisper on the polished linoleum floor. Dr. Marcus flinched slightly, irritated by the interruption. "Doctor," I said, my voice dangerously level, every syllable measured and precise. "My father is describing classic symptoms of intermittent claudication, secondary to long-term arterial stress. This requires immediate, non-invasive imaging and testing, not dietary advice and thinly veiled accusations of poor lifestyle choices." Marcus finally turned his head, but only halfway. He didn't turn his body toward me. He just flicked his wrist impatiently. "Ma'am, with all due respect, I am the attending physician here, and I have 30 years of experience distinguishing real vascular problems from common anxiety. And frankly, anxiety often manifests as phantom pain in older patients who are, well, overly concerned with their health." He called my father overly concerned. He called the man who built my entire career possible a liar, a fraud, a nuisance. I felt the years of sacrifice, the weight of the PhD, the countless sleepless nights spent studying to hold the rank I now held, all boiling up inside me. My father raised his hand weakly, seeing the sudden stiffness in my posture. "Anya, please, let's just go home. I'm tired. We can see Dr. Peterson next week." He was trying to protect me from this man's inevitable scorn. He worried about the daughter who talked back to a white doctor. That was the moment the daughter stepped aside entirely. The director of clinical excellence took over. The authority I spent my life earning, the power I rarely displayed in public, demanded to be recognized. I didn't reach for my phone to call hospital security. That was too slow and too loud. I didn't need to yell or make a scene. That was undignified. I reached into my designer handbag, which sat on the examination table. I pulled out my laminated identification badge. It wasn't just a badge. It was a heavy plastic rectangle with the hospital system's silver hologram seal flashing under the fluorescent lights. My full name was printed clearly. Below it, the title, Director, Regional Medical Oversight and Quality Assurance. I placed the badge flat on the examination table. I set it right next to Dr. Marcus's tapping pen. The pen stopped moving instantly. The sharp click, click, click was replaced by a massive silence. The atmosphere in that tiny, sterile room shifted completely. The temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees. Marcus finally looked at me, fully this time. His eyes scanned the photo, the title, the holographic seal, and then back to my face. The smug confidence he had worn like armor for 30 years vanished completely. His face went pale, a sickly, ashen color spreading across his cheeks. He tried to laugh it off, a terrible dry sound that caught in his throat. "Anya, Dr. Davis? I didn't recognize you. Is this some kind of elaborate joke? What are you doing here, wearing—" He gestured vaguely at my clothes. I ignored his stuttering panic. I looked down at my father, whose face was now etched with a mixture of confusion, shock, and a strange, deep relief. "The joke," I told Dr. Marcus, my voice dropping low, so only he, standing inches away, could hear the devastating finality of the statement. "The joke is over, Doctor, and effective immediately, I am invoking Article 4, Clause C of the Ethics Charter." I didn't wait for his response. "You are suspended from practicing medicine in any facility within this regional health system, pending immediate, full review of your entire patient file history. Security will be arriving shortly to escort you off the premises. I reached out and picked up his pen. It was a small act, but it felt like I was picking up the remnants of his medical career. I had to ensure my father was stable and transferred to a reputable cardiologist first. That was the primary medical urgency. The paperwork and the legal battle to permanently strip Marcus of his professional standing could wait 5 minutes. But first, I had to move my father before he absorbed any more of the toxic injustice Marcus radiated. I pressed the single button on the intercom beneath the desk. "This is Dr. Davis. I need emergency transport and a full cardiology consult team in exam room 3. Immediately." The air in the examination room was thick and cold. It smelled of antiseptic and casual dismissal. Dr. Thorne tapped the chart with a pen, a dismissive rhythm against the silence. "Mr. Davis," he said, not looking up. His voice was smooth, tired, and dripping with thinly veiled irritation. "I see your primary complaint is persistent chest tightness and joint aches." My father, bless his gentle soul, tried to articulate the precise nature of the pain. He spoke of the dull throb that had been his companion for months, the way it flared after work, stealing his breath. Thorne cut him off. Yes, aches and tightness. That's what the chart says." Thorne sighed dramatically, pushing his chair back just enough to lean away from us. "Let's be realistic, Mr. Davis. You've worked hard your whole life. Manual labor, yes. For 40 years, my father affirmed, proud but weary. Exactly. You are a man of a certain age, from certain background. You expect a few aches. The body wears down. That's just physics, isn't it?" He said, "certain age and certain background," with an emphasis that turned them into ugly code words. They meant, "You are old, Black, and you are wasting my time with routine wear and tear that requires no complex medical thought." I watched my father's shoulders slump. He wasn't arguing for a miracle cure. He was arguing for belief. "The pain has changed, doctor," my father insisted, his voice barely a whisper now. "It used to be predictable. Now, it feels like a pressure, like something heavy is sitting on my lungs." Thorne finally lifted his gaze. His eyes, blue and utterly vacant, swept over my father, lingering briefly on his slightly worn jacket. "Pressure, yes. Everyone feels pressure, Mr. Davis. We are living in stressful times." He chuckled, a small, arrogant sound that didn't reach his eyes. "I see here that you've requested specialized cardiology testing, an echo, possibly. My family doctor suggested it might be prudent, just to rule things out," my father offered carefully. Thorne leaned forward, resting his elbows on the desk. This was the moment the performance turned nasty. "Prudent? Prudent means necessary, Mr. Davis. Look at your vitals. They are marginally elevated, sure, but well within the limits for someone who, frankly, needs to lose about 20 pounds and stop worrying so much." He made air quotes around the word worrying. The insult was not subtle. It was delivered with the clinical authority of a medical professional, making it sting twice as deep. It implied my father's suffering was purely psychosomatic, a failure of discipline, not biology. I felt the blood drain from my hands, leaving them cold and heavy. I was sitting there, 2 feet away, the director of clinical operations for the Northeast region, overseeing the licensure of physicians just like him, and I was reduced to a silent, anonymous daughter, watching her hero be dismantled by a petty bigot in a white coat. "Be patient," the ice in my veins commanded. "Let him hang himself." I needed undeniable, documented professional negligence, not just dismissive racism, which is common and often hard to prove, but a clear violation of standard procedure. Thorne glanced at the lab results display on his screen, scrolling quickly, disinterested. "Everything looks fine here. Cholesterol is high, Typical. Glucose is managed. Really, Mr. Davis? I suggest a simple lifestyle adjustment. Try some light walking, perhaps a vitamin supplement. We are not going to clog up the cardiology queue for common musculoskeletal complaints. My father's face was a map of hurt and defeated hope. He had taken the day off work. He had waited 3 weeks for this specialist referral, all to be told he was fat and anxious. He slowly began to put his shirt back on, the heavy silence of the room amplifying the rustle of the cheap cotton. "And if the pain gets worse, doctor?" my father asked, his voice rough. Thorne stood up, signaling the consultation was over. His movements were impatient, radiating finality. "If it gets worse, you call your primary care physician, Mr. Davis. But honestly, I think a shift in perspective is what you truly need. Focus on the positive. Stress is a killer, you know." He was already moving towards the door, his attention shifting to the next patient, the next insurance code, the next quick check of the box. We were invisible to him. My mind was running the clock backward. I replayed the consultation. I remembered the exact moment Thorne minimized my father's previous medical history, a quiet mention of non-specific intermittent tachycardia 10 years prior. Then I focused on the screen. While Thorne was scoffing at the anxiety hypothesis, he had scrolled past a specific reading, a small anomaly in the troponin levels, indicated by the lab report. It wasn't high enough to trigger an immediate code blue, but it was certainly elevated enough to warrant the echo my father requested. Standard protocol demanded a follow-up imaging study with those markers. Thorne had intentionally ignored a subtle yet significant indicator of myocardial strain. He didn't just dismiss the patient, he dismissed the science because of who the patient was. That was the nail. Solid, verifiable medical malpractice, tied directly to his prejudicial attitude. I stood up slowly, ensuring I was directly in Thorne's sightline before he could fully open the door. I smoothed the lapels of my simple tailored blazer, the one that deliberately masked my identity when I was off duty. My voice, when it came, was low, measured, and unnervingly calm. It held none of the emotion boiling beneath the surface. It was purely professional, the voice of an auditor, not a distressed daughter. "Dr. Thorne," I said. He paused, irritated at the delay. He looked at me, his eyes flicking over me quickly, registering nothing remarkable. "Yes, miss," he replied curtly. I met his gaze dead on. I didn't smile, didn't threaten, and didn't raise my voice. "Before we leave, doctor, just for the record, regarding the current institutional policy on cardiac workup protocols for patients presenting with atypical chest pressure and slightly elevated troponin T markers in the presence of established risk factors, could you confirm what the current mandatory follow-up step is, per the governing medical board?" I used the language of administration, not medicine. I used governing medical board. Thorne's practiced, dismissive smile faltered. The sudden shift in terminology, the sharpness of the technical question, threw him off balance. He blinked, clearly annoyed that this daughter was using terminology that implied professional knowledge. "The protocol is subjective," he hedged, trying to recover his superiority. "No, doctor," I corrected him gently. "I believe the mandatory protocol states that a full echocardiogram is required within 48 hours, pending review by the chief of cardiology, before a definitive anxiety diagnosis can be officially entered into the patient record and subsequent specialist referral denied." I watched the slow realization dawn in his eyes. He didn't know who I was, but he suddenly knew I wasn't just some daughter. He was now trapped in the sterile, unforgiving logic of the institution he thought he commanded. "Are you questioning my medical judgment?" he demanded, his irritation finally bubbling into anger. I simply looked at him, my expression blank. I am merely confirming the established protocol, doctor. You neglected to schedule that scan, didn't you? He opened his mouth to lie, to bully, to rationalize, but no sound came out. He knew the paperwork trail would betray him. The execution phase was about to begin. But first, I needed him to understand exactly where he stood. And I needed my father safe. We will retrieve Mr. Davis's medical file now, I stated, moving towards the door. We are transferring his care to a different facility immediately. I looked at Dr. Thorne one last time, measuring his fear. He had laughed at my father's symptoms. Now, he was starting to understand the cold, systematic symptoms of his own professional demise. He didn't know the blade was already sharpened, but he felt the chill of the air shifting around him. The next move had to be precise, devastating, and immediate. There was no time for polite goodbyes. I closed the door behind us, leaving him alone in the room with the silence of his error. The only question now was how fast I could sign the paperwork to suspend his privileges, and if my father would be okay. The silence in the examination room was heavy, smelling of sterile disinfectant and bitter shame. My father looked smaller than I had ever seen him. Sterling's casual cruelty had deflated him instantly. I felt the heat rising in my own neck, not just anger, but a profound, sickening professional betrayal. I had seen doctors fail, but rarely had I seen malice masquerading so thinly as medical opinion. Sterling was already sliding his chart away, humming slightly, moving on to the next number on his list. "Dr. Sterling," I said, my voice cutting across his humming. I stepped closer to the examination table. My father's hand shot out subtly, a silent warning. "Don't make trouble, Lena." "Yes. Is there something else, Mrs. Jones?" Sterling didn't even look up. He assumed I was just a worried relative, ready to accept the inadequate diagnosis and leave quietly. "I have a few questions about the differential diagnosis," I continued, keeping my tone unnervingly flat. I didn't introduce myself. Not yet. I wanted him to commit fully to his incompetence. I listed several highly technical symptoms my father had described, symptoms Sterling had waved away as stress or old man's nerves. I used terminology that shouldn't come from a layperson. I named specific cardiac markers. Sterling finally looked up, annoyance etched deeply on his face. "Look, ma'am, I understand you're concerned, but unless you have a medical degree, I assure you, this is standard procedure for generalized fatigue in seniors." He leaned back, crossing his arms, radiating condescension. "I see," I replied. "So, the elevated C-reactive protein levels recorded last month are also standard procedure in your clinic?" That detail caught him. His eyes flickered down to the chart. He hadn't bothered to read the full historical file. He had prejudged the patient based on presentation and color, not data. He recovered quickly, waving a dismissive hand. "Lab anomalies happen. We treat the patient, not the paperwork. Your father needs rest and maybe a few lifestyle adjustments." Lifestyle adjustments. That old code word. It meant he blamed my father's assumed poor choices rather than investigating genuine illness. The internal rage was now cold, sharp focus. "And if I were to inform you," I began, letting the words hang in the air, slowing down my speech significantly, "that his symptoms align precisely with an early-stage presentation of atypical cardiovascular distress, requiring immediate specialized imaging, would you still recommend merely rest and adjustments?" Sterling chuckled, a short, arrogant puff of air. The laugh was what broke the final seal, the laugh he aimed at the concerned daughter, who he thought was playing amateur doctor. "Ma'am, I am a board-certified physician with 20 years of experience. You are an excited relative reading WebMD. I suggest you trust the professionals and let us do our jobs." I took a deep breath. My father was rigid, staring at the floor, anticipating the inevitable public humiliation that usually followed when black people challenged authority in these spaces. I wouldn't let him face that again. "Dr. Sterling," I said, my voice dropping an octave, losing all trace of the concerned relative affectation. It was the voice I used when directing a 12-hour surgery. It was the voice of command. "The patient, Mr. Henry Jones, requires immediate admission to cardiac observation. I am invoking Clause 4.3b of the Metropolitan Medical Standards Review. You will authorize the full cardiac panel, including the specialized CT requested by his primary care physician 3 weeks ago, a request which, by the way, this clinic seems to have mysteriously misplaced." Sterling's eyes narrowed, finally sensing something was terribly wrong. He didn't recognize the clause. Most general practitioners wouldn't. It belonged to the upper administrative tiers of the Medical Review Board. Who are you?" he stammered, his composure cracking slightly. I looked at him, not with fury, but with professional pity. He had sealed his fate not just by being incompetent, but by being cruel. "My name is Dr. Lena Harris," I stated clearly. I paused, letting the name resonate, knowing that in elite medical circles, my name was synonymous with integrity and quality control within the Metropolitan Hospital Group. I waited until I saw the realization dawn, the flicker of fear, then disbelief, then total dread. His jaw slackened. "I am the chair of surgery at Metro Hospital. More importantly, I serve as the chief of professional oversight for this entire regional network, including the independent clinics that contract with us, like yours." I let the full weight of that title settle over him. He was no longer looking at a daughter. He was looking at the woman who signed the contracts that kept his clinic solvent, and the authority who monitored the licenses that kept him employed. "Dr. Harris, I apologize. I didn't realize," he mumbled, trying to scramble backward professionally, mentally reviewing everything he had just said. "Save your apology, doctor," I interrupted, cutting him off before he could taint the air with false sincerity. "We will be reviewing your conduct, your diagnostic history, and specifically the institutional pattern of patient dismissal within this facility. Effective immediately, you are relieved of your duties pending full investigation by the board." I pulled out my phone. It wasn't a show. It was the protocol. I typed a quick encrypted message to my chief of staff. "Initiate immediate temporary suspension protocol 77A. Clinic, Midtown General. Subject, Dr. T. Sterling. Reason, gross professional negligence and violation of patient dignity." My father looked up at me, his eyes wide, confusion mixing with relief. He knew I had done something massive. Sterling, however, was pale, shaking his head slightly in denial. "You can't do that. You can't just—" Sterling sputtered, gesturing wildly toward the door. "I can," I stated, clipping the words short. "And I just did. Your professional oversight review starts now. Please vacate this examination room. The patient requires immediate care." I didn't wait for his response. My focus shifted instantly back to my father. The justice was served, yes, but the priority remained his health. "Dad," I said softly, moving to hold his hand, "we are getting you transferred right now. Everything is going to be okay." He squeezed my hand back, but his relief was tempered by confusion. He knew the fight wasn't over. The battle had been won, but the war for his health and the war against this systemic indifference was only just beginning. We needed those CT results immediately, and I needed to make sure Sterling's corrosive negligence didn't harm another soul. Dr. Thorne's arrogance vanished completely. It was replaced by a terror so profound it stole the color from his face. He didn't stumble backward. He froze forward, like a statue carved from pure panic. He looked at my identification badge. He looked at the hospital logo. He looked at the title printed beneath my name. He started breathing too quickly. A shallow, panicked wheeze. "Dr. Elias," he choked out. The respect in his voice was sickening. It was fear, not reverence. "Director, I assure you, this is a terrible misunderstanding of the context." I put the badge away. The context was perfectly clear. I moved to the side of the examination table, standing between him and my father. I used the voice I reserved for disciplinary meetings: low, level, unbreakable. "The context, Dr. Thorne, is that a patient presented with clear textbook symptoms of possible septicemia and cardiovascular distress," I stated. He tried to interrupt. "I was prioritizing." "You were prioritizing your personal prejudice narrative over evidence-based medicine," I cut him off. "You dismissed the patient's reports. You failed to order baseline lab work. That is mandated by this institution's standard protocols. You committed egregious professional misconduct. I did not allow the confrontation to become emotional. This was an audit, a cold, clinical assessment of failure. I didn't refer to him as a racist. I referred to him as a breach of contract. Protocol 4A states that all physicians shall treat every patient with dignity and apply equitable standards of care, regardless of demographic or perceived socioeconomic status," I continued. He tried to plead with his eyes. He looked desperate. "I was under pressure, Director Elias. I was merely attempting to lighten the mood. I deeply apologize to Mr. Elias if my tone was misinterpreted." "Your tone was not misinterpreted," I said. "It was recorded." I tapped my phone, which had been recording the entire interaction, standard procedure for my surprise inspections. I didn't even need the recording. The witnesses were enough. "You laughed at a patient experiencing pain. You openly mocked his medical history," I told him. "Do you believe that is conducive to saving lives, Dr. Thorne? Do you think that is what your oath means?" His shoulders slumped. The performance was over. The tiny kingdom he built in this exam room had crumbled. I reached for the secure line on the wall. I bypassed the front desk entirely. I rang the chief administrator, Mr. Davies, and the head of security simultaneously. "This is Dr. Anya Elias, Director of Clinical Standards. I require immediate response to exam room 3. Dr. Thorne has committed a grade 1 breach of professional integrity. This is an immediate administrative suspension." I used the language of absolute authority. No room for debate. Thorne started shaking his head rapidly. "Anya, please, Dr. Elias, this is career suicide. One lapse in judgment. Just a conversation." He took a step towards me. Security arrived instantly. Two very large, impassive men who knew exactly who I was and what my directives meant. They positioned themselves between Thorne and the exit. Mr. Davies, the administrator, arrived seconds later, breathless and pale. He was acutely aware that a grade 1 breach being handled personally by the director meant irreversible damage. He looked at me for confirmation. I simply handed him the pre-signed suspension form I kept in my audit case. "Mr. Davies, ensure Dr. Thorne's credentials, access keys, and hospital identification are surrendered immediately," I instructed. "His clinical privileges are suspended pending full board review. He is to be escorted off the property and his access deactivated within the next 5 minutes." Thorne turned frantic. He tried to appeal to Davies, the administrator. "Davies, you know me. We play golf. We have lunch. This woman is making an example of me for a single joke." Davies wouldn't meet his eyes. He only looked at the suspension form, nodding stiffly. The system was already closing in on Thorne. My word was law in this building. "Dr. Thorne," I said, ensuring my father could hear every syllable of the vindication. "This wasn't about a single joke. This was about a fundamental failure of your character that poses an imminent danger to vulnerable patients." I stepped back to let security approach him. He looked truly destroyed. His eyes, seconds ago filled with superiority, were now wet with panic and self-pity. He looked at my father, trying one last pathetic plea for clemency. "Mr. Elias, sir, please, talk to your daughter. This is too much. Please." My father, leaning back against the wall, watched the spectacle. His breathing was labored, but his eyes were clear. He didn't say a word to Thorn. He didn't have to. He simply gave me a small, slow nod, the quiet sanction of a proud father. "Take him," I told security. They moved quickly and efficiently. Thorn tried to resist, muttering things about lawyers and injustice, but it was just noise. They walked him out, the door clicking shut behind them, sealing his fate with a final, echoing sound. The silence that followed was immense. I was victorious. The injustice was repaid immediately and formally. The doctor who had mocked my father was gone, his career shattered by the very authority he failed to recognize. But the triumph lasted only a second. I turned back to the room. The sterile equipment, the high stakes, the empty space where the petty, cruel doctor had just stood. My father was still sitting there, weak, breathing shallowly. The illness had not left with Thorn. The real threat remained. I pushed away my role as director of standards. I was a daughter and a surgeon. "Pops," I whispered, rushing to his side. "I'm calling the ER prep team. We are bypassing admission. I need the full cardiac and infectious disease panel now. I'm admitting you myself." I placed my hand on his forehead. It was warm. Too warm. The clock had started ticking the moment Thorn laughed. Now, I had to save the life he had been so willing to gamble away. Justice was served. Now, the real work began. We left the examination room in silence. The fear in my father's eyes was gone, replaced by a tired resignation. It was the look I had dreaded seeing since I was a child. The look that said, "They won again." "I tried, Ava," he whispered, leaning heavily on my arm. "I tried to tell him the pain wasn't normal." "I know, Daddy. I heard you." He was trembling, but not from weakness. It was the shock of the humiliation. They did not just disregard his symptoms. They disregarded him. I helped him find a quiet, cushioned bench far away from Stern's office area. "I need you to stay right here, Daddy. I need 5 minutes." He nodded, knowing exactly what I meant. The temperature in the hospital corridor dropped 10 degrees when I pulled out my phone. The daughter vanished. The executive officer stepped into the sterile air. I bypassed my private office line. I called the CEO of the regional health system directly. Mr. Henderson answered on the second ring, sounding surprised by the late hour. My voice was stripped of emotion, clinical, dangerous. "Mr. Henderson," I stated, "this is Dr. Ava Johnson. I am invoking Clause 40B of the Professional Ethics Charter." Silence crackled over the line. Clause 40B was rarely invoked. It authorized immediate administrative holds pending extreme ethical breaches. "Dr. Johnson, that is a nuclear option. What facility are we discussing?" "St. Jude's Regional. Dr. Jonathan Stern." Gross negligence and blatant patient disregard rooted in discriminatory practice. I didn't explain who the patient was. I didn't need to. The severity of the accusation coming from me was enough. "I require an immediate, documented, administrative suspension placed on his privileges. Physical access keys deactivated within the next 30 minutes. Henderson cleared his throat. "I understand the gravity, doctor, but we must follow due process." "Due process starts after the immediate halt of patient endangerment, Mr. Henderson. I witnessed this personally. If I have to authorize this order unilaterally as Chief Integrity Officer and bypass your department, I will." The threat hung in the air. Henderson knew the hierarchy. He knew the board would always side with my oversight office in a negligence dispute, especially one I had personally verified. It's being drafted, Dr. Johnson. The notice will be served within the next 15 minutes. We will cite an internal investigation. I hung up without acknowledging his surrender. My heart was beating hard in my chest, not from fear, but from the cold focus required to dismantle a career in under 10 minutes. This was not vengeance. This was triage. I looked at my father still sitting on the bench, hunched over, small in the massive hallway. This was necessary surgery. I pulled up the draft email notification confirming the suspension. I scrolled to the bottom. I watched my title flash on the screen. Dr. Ava Johnson, Chief Integrity Officer, Western Sector Board. I hit send. The administrative wheels were turning. Dr. Stern had no idea that his entire professional scaffolding was collapsing around him. He was likely still in his office, signing off on paperwork, perhaps taking a late-day call, basking in the smug satisfaction of having humiliated an old man he deemed unworthy of his respect. I walked back down the corridor, the official email confirmation now resting in my inbox. The suspension was active. When I reached his office door, Marie, his secretary, was gone. The overhead lights were slightly dimmed. Dr. Stern was sitting at his desk, his jacket off, charting notes. He looked tired. He looked up and saw me standing there. He tried to adopt his earlier dismissive smirk, the one that made my father feel so small. "Look who found her way back," he said, leaning back in his chair, folding his hands over his stomach. "Did you finally realize that I was right? That all your father needs is to lose the weight and stop exaggerating?" He laughed, a quick, sharp, cruel sound. I did not move toward him. I stood perfectly still, 3 feet inside his office. "I am not here as Samuel Johnson's daughter, Dr. Stern." His expression shifted slightly. The professional tone of my voice finally registered. "I am here on behalf of the Regional Health Authority." I raised the heavy sealed envelope I was holding. It bore the hospital's official crest. He frowned, his confusion warring with his ego. "What is this? A referral packet? I'm finished seeing patients for the day." "This is a temporary directive, Dr. Stern, effective immediately." I walked the remaining distance and placed the envelope squarely in the center of his desk, covering his prescription pad. The sharp thud resonated in the quiet room. "You are hereby relieved of all professional duties, pending a full internal investigation into gross ethical violations, discriminatory practice, and patient endangerment." The color drained from his face instantly. He picked up the envelope, his fingers fumbling with the seal. He tore it open and pulled out the short, brutal letter. His eyes darted across the text, searching for a signature, searching for a mistake. You can't do this," he stammered. His voice was suddenly thin, reedy. "The decision has been made, doctor. But who authorized this? Who has the authority to sign a notice this severe?" He looked up at me, his eyes wide, terrified. He had missed the signature block completely. He saw me, Dr. Ava Johnson, standing in his office, but he still hadn't connected the dots. He saw a furious black woman confronting him. He didn't see the administrative mechanism that had just ended his career. "The person who authorized it," I said slowly, emphasizing every syllable, "is the person who witnessed your conduct, documented the negligence, and signed the order." I took a single step toward his desk. I leaned down slightly, lowering my voice so only he could hear me, delivering the final cut. "Look again, Dr. Stern. At the bottom of the page, right above the seal." He whipped his head back down. He scanned the signature line again. He saw the name, Ava R. Johnson, and beside it, in bold, capitalized letters, Chief Integrity Officer. The blood rushed out of his face so fast he looked like a ghost. His breath hitched. He dropped the paper onto the desk, his hands shaking violently. The weight of his mistake finally crushed him. He didn't just mock an old man's symptoms. He mocked the father of the person who governed his professional life. He tried to speak, but only a dry rasp came out. I I didn't know who you were. Of course you didn't, replied, my voice hard and cold. You never bothered to look beyond the surface of anyone you deemed beneath you. You have 5 minutes to collect your personal effects. Security will escort you off the premises. Do not speak to any patients or staff. Any attempt to contact me or my family will result in immediate escalation to the State Medical Board for permanent license revocation. I turned sharply on my heel. The small petty man was left alone in the fading light of his office, his career reduced to a single sheet of paper. I didn't look back. I had surgical precision to maintain. My father's condition needed addressing, and Dr. Stern's disciplinary action was only beginning. The temporary suspension was justice served cold. But the next step, the full investigative hearing, was where the real systemic change would occur, and I would be chairing that review. The badge clinked heavily onto the stainless steel tray I had slid across the counter. Dr. Sterling's face was slick with a sudden, horrifying sweat. His arrogance had dissolved completely, replaced by pure, freezing panic. I did not allow him to sit down. I stood across the examination table, treating the room not as a medical space, but as a disciplinary chamber. My authority was absolute here. We are now documenting the details of your interaction with Mr. Elias Thorne, I stated, my voice completely clinical and stripped of emotion. Specifically, the refusal of standard diagnostic protocols and the clear dismissive commentary regarding a patient's socioeconomic background, which constitutes a severe violation of ethical conduct. Sterling tried to pivot, his mind scrambling for an escape route. He was a master of deflection, but not under this kind of pressure. Dr. Thorne, please, I didn't realize who you were, he stammered, pulling off his stethoscope nervously. It was a stressful shift, a lapse in judgment perhaps. I apologized to your father profusely. I stopped him with a single raised hand. The gesture was tiny, yet it felt like a concrete barrier slamming into his path. Do not invoke my professional title to attempt mitigation for your personal conduct, I instructed him, my gaze unwavering. The investigation is based on the treatment of Elias Thorne, the patient, not Elias Thorne, my father. Your apology now is conditional and therefore worthless. I placed the preliminary suspension order on the counter, next to his badge. It was already signed, having been prepared the moment I confirmed his identity and observed his behavior through the privacy glass from the hall. Effective immediately, your privileges at this institution and all associated facilities under the Metropolitan Healthcare Authority are revoked pending a full ethical review, I dictated, reading the formal text aloud. Sterling actually stumbled back, catching himself on the rolling stool. Revoked? Nia, that's career suicide. You can't. This is an overreaction. We are talking about chest pain. That could have been indigestion. He was shouting now, his previous confidence shattered. He couldn't fathom the reality of his situation. We were talking about unexplained symptoms from an elderly patient, I countered calmly, listing his failures one by one, which you dismissed as junk food fatigue and a likely tummy ache before performing any cardiac workup. That is negligent. That is dangerous. That is gross malpractice. That is immediate grounds for license review by the State Board. He saw the finality in my eyes. The desperation in his became evident as he looked past me, trying to calculate which board member he could call first, which political string he could pull before the news broke. You don't understand the network I built here, he whispered, his last desperate attempt at a threat. I have friends in high places, Thorne. I smiled, a cold, thin expression that did not reach my eyes. I understand the network you built, Doctor, I confirmed. I am the firewall. I contacted security immediately. I specified that 2 uniformed officers were to escort him directly from the room, collecting his personal effects from the staff locker room only under supervision. He left the premises under administrative supervision, defeated, pale, clutching his phone uselessly. I watched him go, feeling no triumph, only a deep, weary satisfaction that justice, for once, had been swift and absolute. Then I turned my attention back to the reason I was there. My father. He was sitting quietly on the examination bed, wrapped in a thick blue blanket provided by the attending nurse, Maya, who had witnessed the whole ordeal with growing admiration and terror. "Did you have to do that, Nia?" he asked softly, after the door clicked shut behind the guards. He sounded tired, but his voice was clear. "I didn't have to," I replied, pulling up a chair close to him. I took his hand, checking the pulse point I had instinctively reached for earlier. "But I wouldn't have been able to sleep tonight if I hadn't. That kind of negligence, built on prejudice and arrogance, cannot be allowed to breed within a system I am tasked to protect." I called the chief of cardiology immediately. I bypassed all standard admissions and ensured that my father was moved to the executive wing for immediate comprehensive testing. The care would be handled personally by Dr. Davies, the department head, and the finest nurses in the facility. "No more shortcuts, Dad," I promised him, squeezing his hand. "Only the best. Starting now." Dr. Davies arrived within minutes, profusely apologetic that such an incident had ever occurred under the hospital's roof. He assured me the institution would bear full responsibility for correcting the oversight. As the team prepared to move Dad to a proper room, I watched his face. The fear was gone. The sharp sting of humiliation was slowly being erased. All that remained was a quiet, enduring pride in his daughter. He reached up and gently touched my cheek. "You've come a long way, girl." Justice was not just sweet. It was absolutely necessary. But the fight was not truly over. The board meeting would be brutal. Sterling would hire a team of expensive lawyers and fight his suspension and the subsequent license investigation tooth and nail. I knew the next few weeks would be professional warfare, a public scandal that would rock the metropolitan medical community. I just hoped Dad was strong enough to weather the coming storm with me. His recovery was the only thing that truly mattered now. The meeting room was stark. Just me, Dr. Thorne, and the head of HR, Ms. Rivera, who looked profoundly uncomfortable but utterly neutral. I didn't sit across the mahogany table from him. I stood at the end, looking down, holding the stack of documents that represented his entire future. He was a different man now. The arrogant sneer had melted away, replaced by damp patches under his eyes and a sheen of panic across his forehead. "Dr. Johnson, please, we need to talk about mitigating circumstances," he stammered, his voice thin, reedy. I laid the folder down. The sound echoed in the silence. It wasn't a plea for sympathy. It was an institutional mandate. "There are no mitigating circumstances, Dr. Thorne. Not for negligence, and certainly not for willful, documented discrimination and malpractice." I had the audio recording, transcribed and notarized. I had the nurse's statements, frightened but truthful. I had the initial misdiagnosis, which, by sheer luck and my immediate intervention, hadn't become a tragedy. "This is political. You're targeting me because—" I cut him off, my voice steady, professional. "Because you violated the core tenets of the Hippocratic Oath, institutional policy, and basic human decency. Your actions put a patient's life at risk, Dr. Thorne. That patient happened to be my father, but the outcome would be the same if he were anyone else." He launched into the pathetic defense of the exposed bully. He tried to claim he was overworked. He tried to claim I misled him about my position. I let him finish. I watched the clock tick down the minutes of his career. Then I slid the documents toward him. "Effective immediately. Your privileges at all affiliated hospitals are suspended, pending a full external investigation by the State Medical Board, which I have already requested personally. He grabbed the pages, his hands shaking so violently he wrinkled the crisp paperwork. This is temporary, isn't it? Just until the review. I met his gaze, my eyes devoid of the rage I had felt earlier, replaced only by surgical finality. It is permanent, Thorn. The suspension of privileges is immediate. The administrative leave is immediate. The final termination hearing is scheduled for 30 days from now, but based on the evidence, you won't be needing a defense attorney. You'll be needing a new career. Miss Rivera cleared her throat softly. The hospital is required to report this incident, Dr. Thorne, both to the Internal Compliance Division and to the State Licensure Board. Your license is effectively frozen until the investigation concludes. He looked utterly defeated. The reality of having everything stripped away in an instant hit him like physical force. He knew I wouldn't stop. I had the power. And more importantly, I had the truth. You have destroyed me, he whispered. No, I replied, pushing myself off the table. You destroyed yourself the moment you decided my father's dignity and his life was less valuable than your preconceived bigotry. I merely signed the paperwork. I walked out of the room, leaving him to face the silence of his implosion. Justice wasn't loud. It was methodical, institutional, and absolute. Later that afternoon, I sat by my father's bedside in the private executive wing where he had been transferred. He was awake now, stable, resting comfortably. The proper specialists had been brought in, the tests run, and the correct medication administered. He looked better than he had in weeks. I held his hand, smoothing the lines on his knuckles. You look tired, Lena, he murmured, his voice stronger. I'm fine, Papa, just making sure the paperwork is tidy. He squeezed my hand gently. The man, Thorne, what happened? I hesitated, wondering how much detail he needed to know. He is no longer practicing medicine, Papa. He won't be hurting anyone else. Not here, not anywhere I have jurisdiction. A slow, sad smile touched his lips. It wasn't triumph. It was relief mixed with the exhaustion of a lifelong struggle. I wish it hadn't come to this, Lena. I wish you hadn't had to use that big title just for them to treat me like a person. His words pierced me. He was right. That was the real tragedy. That excellence, that seniority, that authority. It shouldn't be a prerequisite for basic respectful care. I know, Papa, but I had it, so I used it. That's what it's for. He sighed deeply, closing his eyes. You're a good daughter, baby girl. A good doctor. I watched him drift back to sleep. My responsibility wasn't over. The fight against Thorne was finished, but the fight against the institution that allowed him to thrive was just beginning. I couldn't just fire one bad apple. I needed to investigate the department culture. I needed to know who else ignored the signs. I needed to ensure that no one else's father, mother, or child had to rely on a surprise display of power just to survive a hospital visit. I pulled out my phone and sent a discreet, coded message to my lead compliance officer, scheduling a full, unannounced audit of the hospital's patient care intake protocols, starting tomorrow. Morning. The vengeance was complete. Now, the protection began. I sat there in the quiet room. The sterile air, a vast improvement over the chaotic arrogance of the emergency department. I finally allowed myself to feel the weight lift. Thorne was gone. My father was safe. But I knew this wasn't an isolated incident. This was just one victory in an endless war fought not with weapons, but with institutional power and relentless paperwork. And I had plenty of both. The sun began to set, casting long shadows across the immaculate room. The battle for Arthur Johnson was won, but the doctor of oversight was far from done with the system that had almost failed him. Tomorrow, the cleanup began.